On October 25th, 2012, Yoselyn Ortega, this defendant, intentionally and savagely slaughtered Lucia Krim and Leo Krim, murdering them in the family's apartment, in the bathroom of their apartment at 57 West 75th Street here in New York County. Lucia was known as Lulu, and she was 6 years old. Leo had just turned 2. And the defendant, this defendant, who was at the time their 50-year-old babysitter, was entrusted with their care, and she viciously and violently attacked Lulu and Leo when she was alone in the apartment with them, when she knew that their mother was out of the apartment, when she knew that their mother was with their 3-year-old sister, and she was alone with the children in the apartment. As I said, the defendant waited until she was sure that the mother was out of the apartment before she returned to the apartment with Lulu and Leo that afternoon, took knives from the kitchen, and repeatedly slashed and stabbed them in the bathroom of the apartment, laying their bodies on top of one another to bleed out in the bathtub. The evidence will show that the defendant returned to the apartment on October 25th, 2012 with Leo and Lulu just before 4 p.m. and that their mother, Marina Krim, frantically returned to the apartment at about 5:20 in the afternoon looking for her children. In the approximately 90 minutes that the defendant was alone in that apartment with Lulu and Leo, the 90 minutes during which the Krims trusted her to care for and protect their children, the defendant brutally butchered both children, slitting their throats. The forensic evidence will prove to you that although Leo, 2 years old, was too small to struggle, Lulu was 6 years old and she fought back. She knew what was happening, she understood what the defendant was doing, and she fought to live. But the defendant was bigger and stronger, and the defendant repaid Lulu's resistance with almost 30 different stab and slash wounds to her body and her neck. Lulu also sustained cuts and abrasions to her hands and arms that you will learn are consistent with her defending herself, evidence of her fight to live. Both Lulu and Leo suffered such severe and deep neck wounds that the first emergency officers on scene thought that they may have been decapitated. Ladies and gentlemen, what I have just told you is the undisputed truth. That this defendant killed those children on October 25th, 2012. That this defendant overcame Lulu's resistance and killed her, as well as her brother. That this defendant slit the throats of Lulu and Leo Krim. That is the undisputed truth. These are the undisputed facts in this case. And these are the facts and the evidence that will prove to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant intentionally murdered Lulu and Leo Krim on October 25th, 2012. That she knew what she was doing when she killed them, and that she knew that killing them was wrong. And there is no credible evidence that you will hear to establish any mental disease or defect that overcomes the truth in this case. That the defendant is guilty of murdering Lulu and Leo Krim, and that the defendant is responsible for murdering Lulu and Leo Krim. Based upon what happened in that bathroom on October 25th, 2012, at 57 West 75th Street, apartment 2FG, the grand jury of the County of New York voted an indictment charging the defendant with 2 counts of murder in the first degree and 2 counts of murder in the second degree. The evidence in this case will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of each and every crime charged. It was 2010 when the Krim family first met the defendant. Marina and Kevin Krim were living on the Upper West Side with their 2 daughters, Lulu and Inez, whom they call Nessie, and Marina was pregnant with their third child. It was the defendant's sister Celia who approached a visibly pregnant Marina at a dance class on the Upper West Side that Marina was attending with her daughters. Celia saw that Marina was pregnant and expecting a third child. Celia was a nanny for another family on the Upper West Side. Celia told Marina that she had a sister who was great with kids, who had worked as a nanny previously, and who could definitely help out when Marina had the third child. Celia recommended that Marina hire her sister, the defendant, when she had the baby. And Celia made the call to her sister, the defendant, to set up the meeting. Now, at this point, the Krims had not had any outside help with the kids. Marina was a stay-at-home mom, but with a third child on the way, and Lulu, I believe, was 4, and Nessie just about to turn 2, they decided that they were willing to consider an experienced nanny to assist them with the child care needs and logistics of 3 children. So, misled into believing that the defendant had in fact worked as a nanny before, the Krims interviewed her in mid to late spring of 2010. They were in contact with a reference that was provided by the defendant, not learning until their children had been murdered by the defendant that this reference was a family member, a relative of the defendant's, who had no children, and whom the defendant had never worked for as a nanny. In fact, the defendant had never worked as a nanny before. And so the Krims, having been deceived, hired the defendant in the summer of 2012, when Lulu was 4, Nessie not yet 2, and Leo not yet born. The arrangement between the Krims and the defendant was that the defendant would work as a part-time babysitter, helping Marina with the logistics of 3 young children. The agreement was that the defendant would work about 25 hours a week for the Krims and would be paid in cash. The Krims did not need or want full-time help or a live-in nanny, but they did want and need and very much appreciate the part-time help that the defendant provided, mostly in the afternoons, to help with pickups and drop-offs, schools, classes. For example, if Marina was going to stay home with Leo, the defendant could pick up Lulu from school or Nessie from a play date. In the alternative, the defendant could stay home while Leo was napping, and Marina could focus on the girls. This was the arrangement that the Krims and the defendant had, and this is the arrangement that worked for approximately 2 years, until October 25th, 2012. On October 25th, 2012, Kevin Krim was on a business trip, returning that night from San Francisco. That afternoon, Marina Krim planned to take their middle daughter, Nessie, to swim class, and then to pick up Lulu, who was then 6, from dance. But because school was over, because Lulu's school ended at 3:15, her dance class started at 3:45, and Nessie's swim class was at 4, Marina couldn't be in all those places at once. So the defendant was expected to and asked to pick up Lulu from school, take her to dance class, and then go home while Leo napped. Marina would take Nessie to swim class, and when swim class was over, Marina and Nessie would go to dance class to pick up Lulu, and the 3 of them would return home. This is the way that everything had worked with the Krims and the defendant for the 2 years she had been working with them. So as scheduled on October 25th, 2012, the defendant arrived at the Krim apartment at 3 in the afternoon. That's when Marina asked her to take Leo with her to pick up Lulu from school on West 78th Street and take her to dance class on West 67th Street. Then to return home with Leo for his nap. Marina explained that she would be taking Nessie to swim class and that she and Nessie would pick up Lulu from dance at 5 o'clock. Within minutes of arriving at the apartment, the defendant took Leo in his stroller and Lulu's ballet bag and left the apartment to go pick Lulu up from school, with the understanding that she was then taking Lulu to dance class. Shortly after the defendant left, Marina and Nessie left the apartment to go to Nessie's swim class at 4 o'clock. And so when Nessie's swim class ended at 4:30, Marina took Nessie down to 67th Street to pick up Lulu from dance, because her dance class ended at 5. But when Marina arrived at the dance class on West 67th Street, she learned that Lulu had never made it to dance class, and she feared that something was terribly wrong. But ladies and gentlemen, what Marina Krim feared might have gone wrong did not even approach what had actually happened. It was just about 5 p.m. when Marina learned that Lulu never made it to dance class. In the 2 years that the defendant had been working with the Krim family, she had never not been where she was supposed to be. She was reliable, and it's why the Krims worked with her for 2 years and trusted her with their children. Marina began texting the defendant. Where are you? Where's Lulu? Donde está? You will see surveillance footage of a frantic Marina sending these text messages. You will see these text messages sent by Marina, text messages to which the defendant never responded. You will see surveillance footage of Marina not getting any response to her texts and calls, grabbing Nessie at the dance studio, and bolting for home. You will learn that when Marina arrived home, it was about 5:20 in the afternoon, and she went upstairs to the apartment, which was quiet and dark. She didn't see the children, and she didn't see the defendant. But she did see Leo's stroller, and she did see Lulu's ballet bag. So she texted again, where are you? And again, she received no response from the defendant. So Marina went out of the apartment, down to the landing, and yelled to the doorman on duty, have you seen my children? Have you seen the defendant? And the doorman on duty, who started his shift at 4 in the afternoon, said he had not. So Marina went back into the dark apartment, holding Nessie's hand, and went through the entire apartment, quiet and dark, holding Nessie's hand, calling out for Lulu, calling out for Leo, until she got to the very last room of the apartment, the bathroom at the back of the apartment. Still holding Nessie's hand, Marina Krim opened that bathroom door. And what she saw was unimaginable, inconceivable, unthinkable. Marina Krim opened the bathroom door and saw the bloodied, lifeless bodies of her 6-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son stacked in the bathtub, their eyes open, covered in blood, staring ahead. And between her and her dead babies was the defendant, the person responsible for this atrocity, standing, holding one of the knives that she had used to kill those babies. Once Marina registered what she was seeing, the defendant took that knife she was holding and plunged it into her own throat. Upon seeing her massacre children and knowing immediately that they were dead, Marina grabbed Nessie and ran out of the apartment. She collapsed on the landing, sobbing uncontrollably and crying incomprehensibly that her children were dead. Hearing Marina's screams, the doorman, Mr. Luby, called 911. You will hear that 911 call. You will hear Marina Krim's anguished and painful cries as she is on that landing, sobbing while he is making that call. You will learn that the super of the building, Mr. Michael Minahan, while Mr. Luby was making the call to 911, Mr. Minahan went to the Krim apartment to try to understand what had happened. And when he opened that bathroom door, he understood. He understood that what he had seen was pure evil. And not knowing what else to do in that situation, Mr. Minahan ran to the front door of the apartment, held it shut with both hands, using his foot against the wall as leverage to keep inside what he had just seen. The responding officers to that 911 call that Mr. Luby made were directed to the apartment 2FG, where they found Mr. Minahan securing the front door to that apartment. Not knowing what to expect, the first officers to arrive drew their guns and went through the apartment, securing the apartment room by room until they reached that back bathroom and the horrific scene inside it. Lying on the floor, face up in the doorway, was the defendant, bleeding from a self-inflicted wound to her neck. Beyond the defendant, in the bathtub, were the bloody and lifeless bodies of Lucia and Leo Krim. Despite the fact that everything in that bathroom indicated that Lulu and Leo were dead, the officers did what they were trained to do, and they attempted to revive them. They tried to save them. But neither Lulu nor Leo had a pulse, and Leo's body was already cold. Emergency Services Unit detectives and emergency medical personnel responded shortly thereafter. You will hear them describe the horrors of what they observed in that bathroom. The blood all over the bathroom. One of the bloodiest scenes they had ever responded to. The bloody and lifeless bodies of the children in the bathtub. Leo so covered in blood that the officer who removed him from the bathtub feared that Leo might slip from his grasp. And the defendant, the person responsible for what they were seeing, lying on the floor, bleeding from a self-inflicted wound, but breathing steadily and not in any immediate danger. And so the EMTs and emergency services detectives, like the first responding officers on the scene, ignoring the hopelessness of the situation, immediately responded to the children and attempted life-saving measures. The children were taken out of the bathtub one at a time and placed on one adult-sized backboard, where CPR and chest compressions were attempted. But as you know, those chest compressions and that CPR did not do anything. As anyone who saw the children knew immediately, there was no way to save them. The devastation that the defendant had inflicted on their little bodies was too much. They had lost too much blood when the defendant slit their throats and severed their jugular veins. They were gone, and they could not be saved. Nevertheless, the bodies of the children were rushed to St. Luke's Hospital, where almost immediately upon arrival they were pronounced dead. Marina, still clutching Nessie, was taken in a separate ambulance to St. Luke's Hospital to be with her children. At this time, Kevin Krim was flying back from San Francisco. And for those few hours that he was in flight, he was blissfully unaware of the nightmare to which he was returning. But he was met at the gate by New York City Police Department homicide detectives, who took him directly from JFK to St. Luke's Hospital to be with his wife and children and to say goodbye to Lulu and Leo. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the evidence in the case, the evidence that establishes beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant butchered these two children. This is the evidence that will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of 2 counts of murder in the first degree and 2 counts of murder in the second degree for intentionally killing Lucia Krim and Leo Krim on October 25th, 2012. At the end of the case, when Judge Carroll instructs you on the law, you're going to hear that there are a number of elements that must be proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt. A motive for these vicious murders is not one of them. That said, I expect that all of you are asking yourselves and looking to this trial for an answer to the question why. Why did this defendant commit these heinous and vicious crimes against these 2 innocent and defenseless children? Unfortunately, you may never have a satisfactory answer to that question. What the defendant did was not only inexcusable, it's inexplicable. So although there may not be an acceptable answer to the question, the evidence presented in this case, the evidence that will be presented in this case, does suggest some possibilities. You will hear evidence that suggests that the defendant resented Marina Krim for being the mother that the defendant could not be, for being able to provide for her children what the defendant could not provide for her own son, that she resented Marina Krim for everything she was and everything she had. You will hear evidence that the defendant left her own son, Jesus, in the Dominican Republic when he was 4 years old to be raised by her sister, and that in the summer of 2012, just months before the murders, Jesus came to New York to finish high school and apply to college in the United States. You will hear that almost as soon as Jesus arrived, the defendant's stress and anxiety began to mount. You will learn that the defendant enrolled Jesus in private school so that he didn't have to repeat the 11th grade and therefore had to pay private school tuition. You will learn that the financial strain of private school tuition, rent, and the general cost of supporting a 17-year-old son weighed heavily on the defendant, and that within months of Jesus' arrival, the defendant was forced to move herself and Jesus out of their apartment that they had in the Bronx and back into an apartment with other family members. The evidence will show that due to her feelings of anxiety and stress, the defendant made an appointment to see a psychologist on October 22nd, 2012. You will hear from that psychologist and learn that the focus of that 45-minute appointment was on the defendant and her relationship with her son, and her stress and anxiety and her feelings of failure related to her son. You will learn that Marina Krim, aware that Jesus had come to New York to live with the defendant, aware that the defendant was under increased financial pressures, went out of her way to try and help the defendant to make additional income, offering her the opportunity to earn more money by doing some house cleaning at the Krim's apartment, and suggesting the defendant to her friends who needed additional babysitting help. The evidence will show that Marina's offers of assistance enraged the defendant, and that although the defendant maintained a professional and cordial demeanor when dealing directly with Marina, internally she seethed. She seethed at the very idea that Marina would think that she could do additional work. Seethed at the idea that Marina would even consider asking her to do additional work. While the defendant's feelings of inadequacy about what she could and could not provide for her son increased. And as the defendant's feelings of anxiety and stress increased, so did her resentment toward Marina. Through the defendant's own words and actions after the murders, you will learn, and the evidence will establish, this resentment that the defendant had towards Marina Krim. The evidence will show that the defendant waited until Marina Krim opened that bathroom door before she tried to kill herself and avoid responsibility for the murders that she had just committed. The evidence will establish that on October 27, 2012, when the defendant woke up in the hospital, at the first opportunity to speak of the unspeakable, the defendant complained about and blamed Marina Krim. The evidence will show that in the days, weeks, months, and years after the murders, during interviews with psychologists and psychiatrists, the defendant continued to complain about Marina and blame Marina Krim for the problems in the defendant's own life. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence may suggest to you that the defendant's resentment and rage toward Marina Krim had reached a boiling point by October 25, 2012, and that rage and resentment is the motivation behind the murderous rampage that the defendant went on that day. Or you may believe that you have not heard a satisfactory answer to explain why the defendant did what she did on October 25, 2012. because there just isn't a satisfactory answer. But ladies and gentlemen, not knowing why the defendant slaughtered Lucia and Leo Krim on October 25th, 2012 does not mean that the defendant is not responsible for those actions or for those murders. It merely means that there is no good answer. So if it is undisputed that it was this defendant who slit the throats of those children and killed them on October 25th, 2012, why are we here? As you know, the defendant in this case has entered a plea of not responsible by reason of mental disease or defect. Judge Carroll will instruct you on the law at the end of the case as to what elements the defendant must prove to you and what the burden of proof is for the defendant on that affirmative defense. But it was discussed in jury selection, and in the most basic of terms, what this means is that after the defendant is proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of murder in the first degree and murder in the second degree for killing Lulu and Leo Krim on October 25th, 2012, the defendant must prove to you that the majority of the evidence that is reliable and credible establishes that she is not responsible before those murders because she was acting under the influence or under the control of a mental disease or defect, preventing her from understanding what she was doing or that what she was doing was wrong. But ladies and gentlemen, the defendant will not meet that burden. She will not meet that burden because what the evidence in this case is going to prove to you is that the defendant acted intentionally and deliberately when she killed Lulu and Leo Krim. That she understood what she was doing and that she knew that what she was doing was wrong. After you examine and evaluate the evidence presented in this case concerning the defendant's own words and actions before, during, and after the murders, it will be clear to you that she is guilty of the crimes with which she is charged and that she is responsible for her actions. I expect that you will hear testimony that establishes that when the defendant was interviewed by psychiatrists hired by the defense, Dr. Karen Rosenbaum and Dr. Philip Resnick, after she had been indicted for these brutal murders, that the defendant said she had no memory of harming the children or of harming herself, that the devil took over her body, and that the devil used her body to kill the Krim children. These self-serving statements made by the defendant after she had been indicted for these horrible murders are the sole basis of the defense claim that she is not responsible for the murders by reason of mental disease or defect. But ladies and gentlemen, it's your job to examine the evidence presented and determine what is credible, what is believable, what is reliable. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the defendant planned the murders of Lulu and Leo Krim, despite the overwhelming evidence that the defendant carefully executed these murders at a time when she knew she would be able to complete them and not be interrupted, the defense in this case is the devil made me do it, with the defendant claiming that the last thing she remembers before waking up in the hospital after the murders is the devil taking over her body. You will learn that the defendant saw a psychologist on October 22nd, 2012, 3 days before the murders. But you will also learn that this appointment is the only contact that the defendant had with any mental health professional in more than 30 years. You will hear from that psychologist that during their 45-minute appointment, the defendant did not say anything that caused him to be concerned for her or anyone else. The defendant did not mention the devil. The defendant told Dr. Caffrey about her problems, the problems she was actually experiencing, that she was overwhelmed by her current situation, by her family obligations, by her financial situation. According to Dr. Caffrey, after their session on October 22, 2012, it seemed that the defendant had gotten off of her chest everything that she needed to say. And though he suggested that she make another appointment, she didn't do so. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant had problems in the days, weeks, months, likely years before she murdered the Krim children. But the evidence in this case will establish and prove to you what those problems were. They were anxiety and stress. There is absolutely no evidence that these problems rise to the level of a mental disease or defect that absolves her of responsibility for murdering those two innocent and defenseless children on October 25, 2012. Other evidence that proves that the defendant knew what she was doing when she murdered the Krim children, knew that it was wrong, and was not acting under the influence of any delusion or mental illness that controlled her, are the statements that she made when she woke up in that hospital bed. 2 days after the murders, the defendant woke up shackled to a hospital bed where she was being treated for the self-inflicted wounds to her neck. There was a uniformed police officer in the room, and when she woke up, she tried to communicate with him. What didn't the defendant do when she woke up? She didn't mention the devil. She didn't ask, "Where am I?" She didn't ask, "Why am I here?" She didn't ask, "Why am I shackled to the bed? And why are you, Officer Hidalgo, a uniformed police officer assigned to be here with me?" She did not ask, where are Lulu and Leo? Upon waking up in the hospital, the defendant did not ask one question about where she was, why she was there, or the well-being of the children. Before she had time to think it through and come up with a defense, the defendant attempted to justify her actions, to explain the inexplicable. And her explanation in those honest, raw moments when she woke up in that hospital bed on October 27, 2012, did not involve the devil. Instead, she complained about her work, and she complained about Marina Krim. Though unable to speak, the defendant was able to communicate with Officer Hidalgo, mouthing words and using an alphabet chart from the hospital. And in doing so, the defendant complained about Marina and how she felt that Marina treated her. She made complaints of trivial and petty matters for which she blamed Marina. So at the first opportunity she had to tell anyone about what happened in that bathroom, the defendant did not say, "The devil made me do it." What the defendant said was, "I had to do everything and take care of the kids. I worked as a babysitter only, and she wanted me to do everything. She wanted 5 hours of cleaning every week." Even the murders themselves and the defendant's attempted suicide defy the story that the devil was controlling the defendant's actions and that the defendant was not responsible for the murders. When she murdered the children, she targeted specific areas of their body, specifically their necks, and severed both of the children's jugular veins. Because Lulu tried to defend herself, murdering Lulu took a lot longer and a lot more effort than murdering Leo. Lulu sustained approximately 30 different slashes and stabs to her neck and body. Leo only 5. The bodies of the dead children were carefully laid in the bathtub, facing the same direction, next to each other. They were not haphazardly discarded or left on the bathroom floor. The defendant waited until after Marina Krim came home so that she could see Marina's reaction to the carnage in that bathroom before she attempted to kill herself. And stabbing herself in the neck was not only an unsuccessful suicide attempt, it was at least her second unsuccessful attempt, because the defendant also had superficial abrasions on her wrists that didn't even break the skin, indicating hesitation at trying to kill herself by slitting her wrists. And despite her self-serving claims about the devil, by the time the defendant was interviewed by Dr. Ali Khadivi, the psychologist hired by the district attorney's office, the defendant completely abandoned the defense of the devil made me do it and adopted a defense of complete amnesia. Contrary to the defendant's claims that she is not responsible for murdering Lulu and Leo Krim, either because of the devil or for some other reason, the evidence will prove that the defendant was in control of her actions before, during, and after the murders, and that the defendant meticulously planned the murders of Lulu and Leo Krim, which she executed on October 25, 2012. The evidence will prove to you that she knew what she was doing when she killed them, and that she knew that killing them was wrong. On the morning of October 25, 2012, the defendant woke up on time, sent her son off to school, confirmed by text message that he was on the bus on his way to school, and then the defendant got rid of her cell phone. Not another phone call or text message was made from or sent from the defendant's cell phone after 9 a.m. on October 25, 2012. And the defendant's cell phone was never found. Remember when I told you earlier that Marina was frantically texting the defendant when she realized that Lulu never made it to dance class? The defendant knew that she would not be responding to the calls or texts from Marina that afternoon, so she got rid of her cell phone. And by the time she went to work, 3 o'clock that afternoon, cell phone was gone. Before going to work, the defendant asked her sister to take care of and cook for Jesus when he got home from school. And before leaving the apartment she shared with her family members that day to go to work, she left an envelope with her identification and insurance cards for her sister. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant was putting her affairs in order. She put her affairs in order because she knew when she left for work on October 25, 2012, she would not be coming home. Her plan on October 25, 2012 was to kill the Krim children and then to kill herself. The defendant was scheduled to arrive at the Krim apartment on October 25, 2012 at 3 p.m. And on that day, as she had every other day that she worked for the Krim family, the defendant arrived on time. The defendant's plan required that she be alone in the apartment with the children in order to kill them, and therefore she was careful not to give Marina any cause for alarm or concern. Remember I told you earlier that when she left the apartment, she took Lulu's ballet bag under the theory that she was taking Lulu from school directly to dance class? As you all know, the defendant never took Lulu to dance class that day. And in fact, the evidence will prove to you that what the defendant was doing when she was supposed to be taking Lulu to dance class, that she was biding her time, waiting for Marina to leave the apartment with Nessie so she could go back and kill the children, and then kill herself. Thomas Brown, the doorman on duty until 4 o'clock that day, will tell you that just before 4 o'clock, the defendant returned to the building with Lulu and Leo and asked him, "Is the mother home?" Mr. Brown will tell you that he remembers this conversation with the defendant because in the 4 or 5 months that he worked there at that point, the defendant had never uttered a word to him. But on this day, just before 4 o'clock, the defendant asked him, "Is the mother home?" When he responded that the mother had left just moments ago, the defendant took the children up to the apartment. Now, knowing that Nessie's swim class started at 4, the defendant expected that Marina would not be home when she returned with Lulu and Leo that afternoon just before 4. But she had to be sure. And because she'd already gotten rid of her cell phone, Marina wouldn't have been able to reach her had there been a change of plans. So the defendant had to confirm with the doorman that Marina was out before she took those children upstairs to slaughter them. The evidence will show that the defendant had never intended to take Lulu to dance class that day, and that it had nothing to do with the devil. The defendant told Dr. Resnick that she remembers being in the apartment with Lulu and Leo between 4 and 4:30 that afternoon. The defendant told Dr. Khedivi that after getting the children ice cream, they went to Central Park and then went back to the apartment because Lulu needed to use the bathroom. But ladies and gentlemen, the defendant never should have been in the apartment with the kids between 4 and 4:30, and she never should have been in Central Park with them. If she was to pick up Lulu at school at 3:15 on West 78th Street and take her to dance class by 3:45 on West 67th Street, there was not time to go to Central Park and have ice cream. There was no reason to be in the apartment with Lulu and Leo between 4 and 4:30 that afternoon. The defendant was biding her time in Central Park with those kids waiting for Marina Krim to leave. Central Park is not on the way to dance class. Central Park is 2 blocks east of Amsterdam Avenue at 77th Street. The evidence will show that the defendant had to avoid Marina Krim on Amsterdam Avenue when Marina was taking Nessie to swim class, so she took the children to Central Park to wait for Marina to leave. And the murders themselves, as gruesome and horrific as they are, also prove that the defendant was in control of her actions, following a plan meticulously, deliberately, and carefully. She only executed that plan when she knew she would be able to complete it. The defendant took the children to the very back room of the apartment, the last room in the apartment, furthest away from anyone who could help or hear. She committed the murders in the room furthest from the front door, so if anyone did come in, she would have the most time possible to complete the slaughter before being interrupted. And to be sure that no one came into the apartment to stop her from what she was doing, the defendant slit the throats of the children to be sure that neither could scream out for help. The defendant knew that if she did not take these precautions, that she could be stopped or interrupted. These actions by the defendant prove that she knew what she was doing and that what she was doing was wrong. And to avoid being held responsible for the murders that she committed, she attempted to end her own life. She stabbed herself in the neck after Marina Krim opened that door and saw the devastation. Because part of the defendant's plan that day was to avoid responsibility for murdering the Krim children. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant is responsible for murdering Lulu and Leo Krim on October 25th of 2012. And despite the overwhelming evidence that she planned deliberately and intentionally to murder those children, and that she in fact did murder those children, she is still trying to avoid responsibility for her actions. Hold her responsible for those murders. Yoselyn Ortega viciously and violently slaughtered Lucia Krim and Leo Krim on October 25th, 2012, intentionally and deliberately, with a full understanding of what she was doing and that what she was doing was wrong. The evidence in this case, and the law as Judge Carroll will instruct you on it, require a verdict of guilty on both counts of murder in the first degree and both counts of murder in the second degree, and require that you hold the defendant responsible.
All right, on behalf of the defendant, Ms. Van Leer-Greenberg.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Your Honor, Mr. Silver, Joe, Ms. Ortega, Mr. Van Leer-Greenberg. A broken clock is right twice a day. My defense, Yoselyn Ortega's defense, the defendant's defense, will prove the following. She was born on May 1st, 1962, in the Dominican Republic. She is the second youngest of 8 siblings. She grew up in Santiago de los Caballeros in the Dominican Republic. As contrasted, the La Rochelle is a landmark building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Apartment 2FG is located 2 flights of stairs above the lobby. Mr. Minahan lives underneath the Krim apartment. On October 25th, 2012, Mrs. Marina Krim was scheduled to meet my client with Leo and Lulu at the child's activity at 5 p.m. Not take Leo home and put him in for a nap. The evidence will show that my client, Yoselyn Ortega, and Leo and Lulu were walking from PS 87 south in a southerly direction on Amsterdam Avenue from 79th Street to 78th Street at 3:24 p.m. and 53 seconds. The video will show my client walking with Leo in the stroller and Lulu beside her, walking south. My client was pictorially captured. You have to ask yourselves, of what importance is this? What importance is these dates of birth and these timelines and the hours of events? Well, the hours here and presentations of who was where when goes to planfulness, deliberateness, formulation of intent, and timing. Those are very important questions, hence the evidence will address them by both sides. The evidence will show that Mrs. Krim returned to her apartment a bit after 5 p.m. looking for her 2 children. The evidence will show that there was a 911 Sprint printout predicated on 911 calls that were made from 5:26 p.m. forward. They use military time when they're doing Sprint printouts, so they say 17:26 hours as opposed to 5:26 p.m. Female screaming. Possibly something happened to her kids. This is on the Sprint printout. This is what the calls to the dispatch will show. There is a woman named Charlotte Friedman who told Francis Brennan, the detective in this case, that, and she will tell you, that she took the elevator up with Yoselyn Ortega, Leo, and Lulu at 5 p.m. And she spoke to Lulu. And she said my client looked sullen. This is what she told Detective Francis Brennan. Hence the times. Yet, well, the times, again, I mean to enforce the importance of them due to the availability of time and planfulness, deliberation, and my argument is that there was no planfulness and no deliberation at all, none. The evidence will show that sometime after 5 p.m., Mrs. Krim did go into the bathroom closest to the children's bedroom. The door was closed. When she opened the door, the evidence will show Mrs. Krim saw Josie. That's what she called my client, Josie, not Yoselyn, standing in front of the sink, all bloody and holding something in front of her neck with both hands that she was pulling on. She saw Lulu and Leo in the tub bleeding and not moving, both with their eyes open. The evidence will show that the second person to enter the subject apartment was Mr. Michael Minahan, the superintendent, and that he in fact held the door, the front door of apartment 2FG closed until the first uniformed police officer arrived on the scene. The evidence will show that my client, Yoselyn Ortega, has no prior arrest record, was a college graduate, and has worked since she could walk and talk. My client, the evidence will show, was born and raised in an intact family. She was born to Rafael Ortega and Maria de Los Angeles Garcia. The evidence will show, and I will bring forth, that the Ortegas owned and operated a bodega in the Dominican Republic. And according to witnesses, the parents of Yoselyn Ortega were able to provide a comfortable life for all of their children. Both parents worked in the store with their children's assistance. Historically, the Ortega family, the evidence will show, has suffered a string of tragedies, deaths, suicides, and mental illness that have spanned generations. The evidence will show that in the years 2008, 2009, Yoselyn Ortega was living in the Dominican Republic with her son Jesus. His last name is Frias. Subsequently, Yoselyn Ortega returned to New York and resided with her sister Celia at first, and then her family at 610 Riverside Drive, apartment 26. She became employed by the Krim family in May of 2010, so that on or about October 25th, she had been working for them for about 2.5 years. On October 25th, 12, there was an irreversible set of acts that has caused unrelenting, torturous pain for two families. Neither family will ever be the same. The evidence will show that on October 25th, 12, at about 6 p.m., Yoselyn Ortega was taken by ambulance to the New York Presbyterian Hospital Weill Cornell Medical Center, located on 68th Street and York Avenue. And the two Krim children were taken to St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital on 59th Street and 10th Avenue. Both children were declared dead. My client, initially unresponsive, then survived. My client was admitted to the hospital, the evidence will show, at 6:30 on that date, but not under the name of Yoselyn Ortega, under the name of Urgent 1. Not under her actual date of birth of May 1st, 62, but under a fictitious date of birth, January 1st, 1977. While en route to the hospital, my client was unresponsive and bagged by EMS. At the hospital, Ms. Ortega was anesthetized, intubated, and initially diagnosed with a penetrating neck injury, a cricoid fracture, a thyroid transection with bilateral slash marks to her wrists, both wrists. At 10:45 p.m. on that same night, the doctors performed an emergency exploration of Ms. Ortega's neck wound. At that time, my client's medical records indicate, and the evidence will show, that she was administered medications, lorazepam, heparin, gluconate, propofol drip, and fentanyl. the evidence will further show that from that date and time until the beginning of November of 12, she was administered those medicines. The evidence will show that on October 26, 2012, Yoselyn Ortega was required to undergo complex surgery to repair her spine. That Ms. Ortega suffered from an impaired mental status, trauma secondary to violence, and was found through the day and night to be unable to engage in any mental activity. For she had, the evidence will show, no mentation. The evidence will show that on October 27th, the day that was mentioned in the People's Opening, when a police officer was placed in Ms. Ortega's room, that my client was sedated and on propofol drip. The evidence will show that the neurosurgeon asked that she remain sedated and intubated until she underwent an open reduction internal fixation, an operation to surgically repair a fractured bone early the following week. The evidence will show that my client was sedated as per the neurosurgeon's recommendation in order to reduce the risk of secondary cervical spinal cord injury before her spine was stabilized. The evidence will show on the very day mentioned in Ms. Grove's opening that at 1:05 p.m., Ms. Ortega, it was said, required complex spine surgery to decompress her canal, repair her dural defect, and stabilize her spine. The evidence will show that on October 27, 12, that very same day, the doctors independently determined that this patient lacked decision-making capacity to make medical decisions because she was intubated and unable to communicate with the presence of a distracting injury. The evidence will show that the duration or Ortega's lack of capacity was prolonged. My client on October 25, 12 was 50 years of age. Today, she's 55 years old. The defense will show that she came to the United States to live when she was in her 20s, that she worked to sustain herself her entire life and to sustain others. The evidence will independently show that up till October 25, 12, she earned a living not only to sustain herself and her son, but others. The evidence will show and the defense will prove by a preponderance of evidence that on October 25, 12, Yoselyn Ortega, at or about 5 p.m., as a result of mental disease or defect, lacked substantial capacity to know or appreciate the nature and consequences of her acts, of her conduct. The evidence will show that Ms. Ortega suffered on that date, at that time, and before that date, October 25, 12, from a chronic mental illness. The evidence will show that she has a corroborated history of hearing voices and dissociating from reality since the age of 16. The defense will show that she suffered from 3 discrete episodes of major depression disorder, psychotic thinking, dissociation, auditory, visual, and command hallucinations, and tactile hallucinations. The most recent episode occurring in the months leading to and on October 25, 12. Other than for a brief period around her age of 16 years, Ms. Ortega has not been treated for her symptoms of psychosis and depression until she was hospitalized and diagnosed at New York Presbyterian Hospital. The defense will prove that from the years 62, when Ms. Ortega was born, in Santo Domingo, until the years 82, 20 years, during the course of the time that she lived in the Dominican Republic, that mental illness was viewed explicitly and implicitly by health care providers as an inescapable condition of the loco, meaning crazy. The evidence will show and prove that Yoselyn Ortega was guarded, G-U-A-R-D-E-D, in her symptoms reluctant to seek care, took refuge in prayer in the church in her faith. The evidence will show that any available care in the Dominican Republic was worse than what she was suffering from, that going to 28 or L28 or the sole psychiatric hospital on the island of Hispaniola in the country of the Dominican Republic, in the country of her birth, was worse than being confined to a shack behind her house called a casita. The defense will focus on the role that untreated mental illness played in the alleged killing of the two children, Leo and Lulu. The evidence will show that what was in fact the condition of my client's mind at the time she allegedly committed the charged acts. The evidence will show her mind's reactions to various stimuli during the 50 years of her existence until October 25th, 12. His Honor will instruct you to use your common sense when evaluating the adduced evidence. You will know a diseased mind when you see it. Do listen to the medical experts, their definitions, their explanations of my client's conditions, their reading of my client's medical records. Weigh what they say. See if it makes sense to each of you. When an expert tells you my client is a malingerer, see if Yoselyn Ortega provided an exaggerated version of her symptoms to try to explain away why she allegedly acted in the manner charged. See if Yoselyn Ortega's headaches were a somatic manifestation of mental illness. See if the evidence proves that a person can carry out goal-directed behavior if she is psychotic. Determine if the finest hospital in New York City, New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center, would prescribe and administer antipsychotic medication and antidepressants and medicine to treat swelling of a person's brain to a mentally sanguine person. See and determine if the experts that came in front of you and swear to tell the truth have ascertainable bases in proven facts. See and determine whether in the weeks and months leading up to October 25th, 12, my client was not sleeping, was not eating, was losing weight. See whether Ms. Ortega was constantly crying, suffering from visual hallucinations, causing her to see shadows, suffering from delusions, causing her to feel as though the devil were penetrating her body and trying to separate her from her family. Was she suffering episodes of dissociation? Was she hearing commands to hurt herself and hurt others? Was she internally preoccupied? Was she acting strangely? Was she preoccupied to a fanatical proportion with religion and prayer? Was she anxiety-ridden?
Judge, I'm going to object to...
Well, this is...
I'm asking them to look.
Yes, I don't think you're right. This is what we stated. This is what the attorneys believe the evidence will show.
Was she suffering from a lack of insight and judgment?
She should find herself to know the statement.
The evidence will show that my client was without necessary medical and psychiatric intervention at these times. Your job now that you, 12 individual sworn jurors and 7 alternate jurors, chosen and sworn as odd jurors, is to determine whether my client laid down memory of the October 25th, 12 incident and whether she is purposefully withholding same.
Objection.
I'm asking these jurors,
I don't think you are.
you are here to determine and judge whether Yoselyn Ortega intentionally, knowingly, and with a conscious objective killed the children she professed to love. You are here to determine whether Yoselyn Ortega, the defendant, is a malingerer, overacting her part as a mentally ill woman. You are here to determine whether she, Yoselyn Ortega, sees less than the blind.
This is not an opening statement.
Yeah. They have been instructed about their duties. So if you want to tell them what you believe the evidence will show, go ahead.
The evidence will show that a malingerer is a person that sees less than the blind, hears less than the deaf, and is more lame than the paralyzed. You are here to determine whether, based on credible evidence, my client could belinger delirium.
Judge, objection.
Continue.
You are here to determine whether my client crowds the canvas with her illness by piling up her symptoms, symptom upon symptom, so she outstrips madness itself.
Judge, I'm going to object again.
I understand your objection.
You must hear, you must determine, you must find whether or not my client was eager to call attention to her illness. You must determine if the rantings of a delirious, medicated person are to be relied upon by you to formulate a motive. I will show and ask you to consider and determine whether or not people who suffer from a mental disease or defect can or cannot substantially appreciate the nature and consequence of their acts.
Judge, objection.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, this is an opening statement. It's what the lawyers believe is the evidence is going to show, and you'll have an opportunity to sum up at the end of the case. So.
Thank you. I will show that the lack of motive in this case is the hallmark of a mentally ill offender. I will ask that you determine whether or not my client had an ability to understand and perceive and confront her illness on October 25th, 12. I will ask you to determine whether she had the prerequisite
Judge,
mental state.
objection as to the summation entirely.
Please confine remarks to what you expect the evidence to show.
Respectfully accept. The insanity defense to be proffered by Yoselyn Ortega is deeply rooted in the cultural and legal traditions of our democratic society. While on the one hand there is legitimate need to hold and punish criminal defendants who are accountable and responsible pursuant to our laws for their actions, there is also the law.
Judge,
Well, I'm going to instruct you on the law, and it's what I instruct you on, you must follow. Okay? Go ahead.
I will argue and the defense will show.
objection as to I will argue.
I will prove and the defense will show that it is wrong, and a wrong has been committed here, an intentional wrong. If a person is capable of that intent, was she capable of forming an intent to kill on October 25th, 12? That is the question here. And I will ask you to determine at the end of this case whether or not these acts were driven by my client's acute psychotic state. Judge, this is what
Overruled. Go ahead.
whether or not these acts that are set out on People's Direct were driven by my client's acute psychotic state. Were they driven by her delusions, her hallucinations, her dissociation, and her severe depression, or were they intentional? Was she acting out in a dissociated mind on October 25th? I implore you to listen and determine whether she experienced on October 25th, 12, a loss of power to choose. And I ask you to regard this defense as you would the proffer of what's shown by the people on direct. Give it the same analysis, assessment, and evaluation, and only make a determination after you've heard all the evidence in this case. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a short break so we can use the facilities, and we'll bring you out shortly. Continue. Please remain seated as soon as the